Hello everyone, I hope you can hear me well. I think we have start almost and so far. There's more joining. Um, can anyone give me a signal if you can hear me well? Yes.
Everything's clear.
Perfect. Welcome everyone. Welcome to this webinar on CTP in Challenging Context. Before we start, may I ask you to switch off your microphone to avoid any background noise or feedback. You can do that by clicking on the microphone icon at the top of the screen. If it's gray, it's switched off. If it's green, it's switched on. And if it's green, a line through it, then it's muted. So far, no background noises. We'd also like to inform you that we record this webinar and that we might upload it to our website or maybe even to our YouTube channel. My name is Stefan Bumbacher and I am CaLP Senior Technical Officer based in Geneva. I lead, among other things, CaLP's workstream on CTP and risk. Thank you very much for joining us today, and my apologies for the confusion about the timing of this webinar. I really did not have in mind that the clocks would change in some countries last weekend, and great to see that some people from Yemen have called in, even considering that it's now past 5 p.m. Quickly looking at the agenda, I am joined today by Hélène Juillard and Jo Hutton, who both wrote a case study on risk on behalf of CaLP. Hélène, together with her team, case study on risk in Mali, and Jo Hutton, case study on Mali, Istanbul, and which was published yesterday, right on time for this webinar. Both consultants will present the case study and the lessons learned, findings and recommendations, and at the end we will have time for questions and discussions, hopefully. Before we look at the case studies, I'd like to introduce CaLP's work on CTP and risk and explain quickly why we are working on CTP and risk this year. The CaLP is focusing on CTP and risk because, according to the State of the World's Cash Report, perceived risk of CTP is still one of the main reasons why humanitarian actors are not routinely considering cash. This concern is linked to on the one hand, to the growing emphasis from donors on anti-terrorism and money laundering, and it's linked to the shrinking budgets for humanitarian assistance as well. The State of the World's Cash Report notes that donors may tolerate the diversion of a small amount of in-kind assistance, but can be much more sensitive about the diversion of cash. This sensitivity has been passed from donors to other humanitarian agencies. And the issue is particularly sensitive in conflict environments where armed groups pose a threat and where it is difficult for humanitarian actors to gain access to affected communities and to get an oversight of the response. One of the global objectives listed in the Global Framework for Action is to ensure that cash is routinely considered alongside other tools. And for this to happen, success will mean that the myths around cash are debunked and the discourse, the attitude, and the behavior of humanitarian actors around the risk of cash will change. It also means that cash is systematically and equally considered based on evidence of actual risks across modalities, that regulatory barriers such as the anti-terrorism and de-risking agendas of donors do not prevent systematic consideration of cash, and that risk is tackled through collaboration between operational humanitarian actors, governments, donors, and financial institutions. And finally, that operational staff have the capacity and the practical tools to identify and mitigate risks. To work towards this goal, CaLP has planned a variety of activities. First of all, we are aligning our priorities and workstream with the risk priority under the Grand Bargain work stream, and other organizations working on risk to build synergies and avoid duplication. Purpose up together with our members, risk working group. Noticing that many of our members are working on risk as well, and that there's an opportunity to identify synergies, avoid duplication, and identify joint priorities. And we have collated literature on risk and mitigation measures on our website with tools and guidance on risk, de-risking, on safeguards, etc. We have outlined 2 case studies on challenging context, Mali and Yemen, which we will have today. And we are planning to do a scoping study on financial management and compliance to understand how CaLP should focus its efforts to support stakeholders with guidance, tools, and other learning to manage CTP-specific risks in finance and compliance. We want to contribute to initiatives on data protection to understand data protection risks as well. We are planning, and we already had one roundtable on risk, where we hope to enable honest discussions about the relative risks of cash and in-kind specific challenging environments. Planning to do replicate that on a regional, national level to look at specific risk-related topics, focusing on more effective context safeguards for CTP. We're conducting webinars, as we're doing right now as well, and we have established a web page on risk, guidance and tools, webinar recording, corrected documents, etc. Having said all of this, we at CaLP are not trying to prove that there's no risk related to CTP, or trying to prove risk-free in a sense, but we believe that any programming has risks in distribution, service delivery, technical. However, we don't think that CTP is riskier than other transfer modalities. We know that good mitigation measures exist, and we believe that there's room for learning and knowledge sharing. The first step in our work streams, we wanted to look at challenging context, to learn about CTP-related risks and mitigation measures, and we have chosen northern Mali and Yemen because both countries have seen significant scale-up of CTP over the last years, despite the fact that both regions are among the most complex and challenging to provide humanitarian assistance. The goal of these case studies is to learn from these contexts and hopefully replicated learning or use that learning to inform response planning in other challenging environments, and ultimately to enable the more systematic consideration. With this short introduction, I'll be handing over now first to Hélène, who will introduce the Northern Mali case study when it was 20 minutes, and then to Jo, who will talk about Yemen. I'd suggest that we leave the questions, or keep the questions for the end, where we have 40 minutes for questions, discussions, etc. And it would be specifically great to hear some reflections from those who are calling from Yemen and or West Africa, those who know these contexts well. And with this, I am handing over to and Hélène just switched to the next slide, which I've got. So these are the new case studies. The case study on Northern Mali exists both in English and French, and the one on Yemen exists only in English, but it comes with a wonderful full-page summary. And with this now, I'm handing over to Hélène.
Hi, thanks, Stefan. Sorry for shifting the slide earlier. So as mentioned, we're going to be together for the next 20 minutes. And during those 20 minutes, I wanted to quickly run you through the findings of this case study that we led on cash transfer programming and risks in northern Mali. Right? So this is just the scene setter. So as Stefan already mentioned, risks has been described as one of the main barriers to the increased uptake of CTP and multipurpose grants. And to break it down a little bit, the conception of risks, and to make it more palatable, we basically, based on key informant feedback, we classified the various risks surrounding CTP in 6 main categories. Those are the ones that are on the slide, right? So insecurity, leakage, inflation and negative market distortions, gender power relation, and intended expenses, and leak of beneficiary personal data. So as you can see, those risks, they are not necessarily CTP specific, right? So what could be CTP specific though is the way those risks materialize, which can differ from one modality to another. Setting the scene, so in terms of the context in northern Mali, so as most of you would know, there has been a military coup that started in 2012 in the northern part of the country, which has basically exacerbated pre-existing structural weaknesses, leading now to an acute crisis across sector, right? So food security, shelter, etc. Since then, despite the fact that there had been peace agreements signed in 2015, the situation has worsened in certain areas, and specifically in the northern part of the country where insecurity and violence have spread. When it comes to cash, the use of CTP, humanitarian actors have been using CTP in Mali at least from 2010 onwards, and mostly, unsurprisingly, to cover food needs, right, during the lean season. And so the outbreak of violence in 2012 brought new challenges and risks to the continuity of aid delivery. And what was interesting is that despite the fact that security risks increase and potential risk of misappropriation also increase, those who used CTP before 2012 not only maintained the use of this modality, but also tended to scale up their cash response. And furthermore, some organizations like WFP, for example, started to use CTP in 2012, so after the crisis began. And when talking to humanitarian actors in country, they basically explain this increased uptake of cash due to, one, limited access to beneficiaries, so it was difficult to send truck in some area of the country, hence it was easier for humanitarian organizations to send in money or voucher. And second, the fact that the needs of the crisis-affected households spread across many sectors. So the use of cash was seen as a way to increase the impact of assistance to cover multiple needs at once, right? So the basic arguments in favor of cash were also valid in northern Mali. And so CaLP selected Mali for this first case study on CTP and risks to basically shed light on contextual changes and how this affect perception of risk and decision-making process. The extent to which the use of CTP was maintained despite increasing challenges, and which mitigation strategy were put in place, and also how effective those have been. In terms of the state of cash, the state of cash in northern Mali, they have been in 2017 about 70%. So CTP represented 54% of the total reported humanitarian funding in country. And as you can see from the graph, those areas where the security is the most volatile, like Kidal, Tombouctou, Gao, Mopti, account for more than half of the cash transfer delivered in the country. So this is the left-hand side graph on the slide. Also interesting, out of the $110 million disbursed through CTP, the majority is unrestricted cash, right? So this is the right-hand side. So there is no parallel in between which area have been the most affected by the crisis in terms of poor security condition and those who are using CTP the least. It's rather the opposite. So having said that and having set the scene, the overall objective of this study was really to contribute to the body of evidence on cash-related risks and mitigation strategy. And we had 5 specific objectives that you can read on the slide that I'm not necessarily going to talk you through. It's also on the reports. To meet this objective and answer those specific research questions, we basically had remote in the field data collection, both primary data collection, secondary data collection. And even though, and this is important to note in terms of the limitation, some documents were considered internal by the organization. So risk assessments, also risk mitigation plans, they were not shared with us. So that's quite important to highlight. Right, so now moving on into what you're here to hear, basically, so the findings. So humanitarian actors operating in northern Mali identified, as I mentioned in introduction, 6 types of risks surrounding the use of CTP. And you can see them by order of importance here on the slide. So just talking you through the 2 first ones, so insecurity and misappropriation. So insecurity was unsurprisingly identified as the most significant risk for CTP. And so this mainly included attack on the road, holdups, violent robberies of equipment or cash delivered to beneficiary. And as you can see, these risks increased over time because we made a comparison of the perceived risk in 2012 to 2015 versus those perceived in between 2016 and right now. And this is mainly changing due to the deteriorating security context. The second one, interestingly, was rarely spontaneously mentioned, but considered as fairly high by those who were prompt about it. And so this basically, the probability of this risk to materialize increased over time, similarly because security access constraints forced humanitarian actors to involve an increased number of local partners and to work more via intermediaries to reach crisis-affected households. So what was interesting is that the main concern regarding the diversion of the distributed cash grant was by service providers, agents, local partner, and less so to link to the financing of armed group and extremists. So that was quite an interesting one. Now, the question we ask, because those risks that I just mentioned, they do not necessarily seem to be linked to the use of a given modality, but more tied to the context. And basically, when asked to compare the identified risk of CTP to the one surrounding in-kind intervention, the vast majority of stakeholders reported that those risks were indeed context-specific, and as such applied to other modalities such as in-kind aid. And so this was quite interesting because it also relates as to how you ask the question, right? If you ask someone in northern Mali, do you think that cash is risky? They're going to say yes, because intervening in northern Mali is risky per se. So this is very much what we found out, and that came out across the 6 risk category that you can see, the 5 risk category that you can see on the slide, is that intervening in this context is risky, full stop. So the fact that the use of cash was risky is not necessarily more risky than the use of another modality. Looking at insecurity, for example, which was the major risk, there was an equivalent perceived level of risk when key informants used to be robbed on the way to distribution center. And some key informants even deemed cash to be less prone to theft, as less visible and easier to carry around for end user. And similarly for all the other risks, right? So that's quite of an interesting finding, and very much linked to how you basically ask the question about risks. What I would like to spend a bit more time on is basically the mitigation measure and how risk had an effect on decision making when it comes to modality. So one thing that I've already mentioned, what is quite important to keep in mind, is that the humanitarian community as well as the donor community in Mali were already using cash before the crisis, and they did not turn back to in-kind when the security context deteriorated. And no one who we have been talking to expressed the wish or even the thought to revert to in-kind, even though some reverted to the use of commodity voucher, and I'm coming to this in a minute. So what came out quite strongly is that risk perception was a key factor for organization to decide to intervene or not in a given area, right? So go, no go for specific geographical area was very much linked to the perceived risk in a given area, but very much less so when decided in between in-kind or CTP, right? Because the decision between in-kind and CTP is very much linked with market functionality, less so with risk factor. Interestingly, further down the line in the response analysis process, perceived risks were almost systematically considered the most crucial element when it comes to choosing delivery mechanism. So once humanitarian actors have decided to go in an area or not, have decided in between in-kind and CTP, they have voted for CTP, perceived risk were one of the key factors to decide which delivery mechanism to use, closely followed by the usual, so to speak, factor of efficiency, effectiveness of each option to achieve project objectives. So this is one of the key findings, is that the diversity of delivery mechanism that CTP offer was used as a mitigation measure in itself by some of the organizations we consulted. Now, for example, when delivering cash in envelope to beneficiaries in northern Mali became too risky, many organizations decided to opt for e-payment mechanism of voucher as a way to sidestep access constraints and risk to transport cash from Bamako, right? And so basically most of the practitioners we've been talking to, they consider switching in between CTP modality and delivery mechanism as a mitigation strategy per se. Ooh, there's something funny happening with the slide here. So in terms of the mitigation measure, right? So even though the risk for cash were not necessarily perceived as being higher than the risk for in-kind, intervening in northern Mali is still fairly risky. So humanitarian organizations implemented a series of measures to mitigate the different risks identified. And so there were three main measures and safeguards that humanitarian actors used. And so they were, but you can see them on the slide as well. So number one, shifting delivery mechanism, as I've just mentioned, and using new technology, electronic system to gain access to area where physical access was impossible, while at the same time retaining a certain level of control over what was happening with the money. Number two, relying on a network of local partners, trusted, known by the crisis-affected households. And number three, ensuring local acceptance and being transparent. Interestingly as well, some mitigation measure and implemented programmatic decision contradict each other. For example, being transparent, right? Some organizations decided to be as invisible as possible, whereas some others decided to communicate a lot. So this comes from different perception, right? And analysis of the risk at stake. And it also varies with organizational practices, policy, reputation, etc. And this is something that is also an important finding, is that risk assessment can be coordinated, but risk appetite and risk mitigation will always be organization specific. At least that's what happened in northern Mali. In terms of the effectiveness of those mitigation measures, they were deemed fairly effective and context appropriate by those who we have been talking to. Most of the interviewees consider that many incidents have been avoided thanks to those mitigation measures. And they also thought that those measures had a deterrent effect and therefore reduced the overall number of incidents. More specifically, organizations who used electronic transfer were quite unanimous on the positive impact technology had on their intervention and on their relevance to mitigate risks in challenging environments like northern Mali. Those systems that we put there that were used in northern Mali, it's not going to come as new to most of you, that they have been tested in various challenging contexts and can therefore easily be adapted or replicated. Yeah. Similarly, with most of the strategy implemented in northern Mali could be replicated to other challenging contexts. Yet, despite this quite overwhelming consensus towards the effectiveness of those mitigation measures, some of them presented some limitation and challenges. So here again, just talking you through the one that came in first in terms of limitation. For the rest, you're very welcome to look at the case study. When it comes to number one, coordination, and that was the major limit we've seen, that mitigation measures were inconsistent across organizations, right? Even for projects implemented in the same area. And as I've said, risk mitigation is very often considered an organization-specific exercise, which results are not shared in coordination fora. Those results were even sometimes not shared with us, the consultancy team. And so there is no framework for CTP-related risk assessment that is used consistently in Mali. And those who have some of those frameworks, they tend to be reluctant to share them. The number two, in terms of limitation, so is the limit to which you can transfer risk to another service provider, right? So most of the interviewee and most of the organization in northern Mali, they have transferred the risk of moving money around and distributing money to financial service provider. And those implementers, as the situation deteriorated more and more, they found it difficult to find service providers willing to take on those growing risks. So it's not only a question of money, right? You pay those providers to transfer risk, but at some point, those providers also deem the level of risk too high, and they are not willing to do it, even for an increasing amount of money. And so what has happened is that CDP implementers, they couldn't be as rigorous in their due diligence that they wish they had when choosing their financial service provider. And in some instances, some of those operations had to stop due to poor quality of the FSP. They basically didn't have the organizational capacity to do the work, not talking about holding up themselves accountable towards the standards humanitarian practitioner would expect. Very much linked to this, and that's going to be my last point, is the extent to which you can use local NGO and transferring risk to local NGO as a mitigation measure. And so here the question is about, okay, to what extent are those local NGOs using the same standard of impartiality, accountability? But it's also a question about ethic, right? To what extent are you, as an international organization, comfortable with transferring risk in operating in a very dangerous environment to a local partner that you are not going to accompany to assess risk and mitigate risk, and who will not have this organizational capacity, not only to distribute CTP, but just to understand what could be done from a humanitarian point of view to mitigate those, and will not have the same leverage. And with that very open question, I'm gonna.
Thank you very much, Hélène, for this interesting presentation. I see that some people are raising their hands. If that's fine with you, we would keep the questions for the end of the presentation, unless we have a very urgent one right here from Ricardo. No. Put his hand down again. On another note, we have some slight problems with the chat. My CaLP colleagues have tried while you were speaking, Hélène, to set up the chat. I saw the chat at the beginning, cannot see it anymore. I don't know who can see it, so unfortunately we have to work this through without the chat. If you have any questions at the end, I guess easy to raise the little hand and just use the microphone. Thank you very much, Hélène. With this, I'm handing over to Jo, who is in a completely different time zone. I think it's around 6 o'clock in the morning. In the West Coast of the US, so thanks a lot for getting up early for us. And I'm handing over to you.
Thanks, Stefan. I hope you can all hear me okay. I'm going to run you through the case study, the very interesting case study that myself and my team did on Yemen. And while there's a huge depth of detail, which of course is in the report itself, I'll try not to delve too far, but feel free, of course, to ask questions after. I see that there are a few people who have joined us who can provide some really good answers, I'm sure, to some of your questions that you may raise, or certainly some more in-depth background or responses to some of those questions. So I don't need to go into too much detail about why Yemen was chosen, but I guess Yemen is a really interesting context for a study of looking at CTP, and particularly sort of immense CTP scale-up in a very high-risk context. Yemen is currently still called the world's worst humanitarian crisis. While it has experienced conflict for a long time, there was a significant escalation in conflict around March 2015. And there are multiple actors involved. I won't delve into the political analysis of that, but it led to a significant worsening of the situation in Yemen. Excuse me. So 75% of Yemenis, 22 million people, are in need of some kind of humanitarian assistance or protection, which is a really high proportion of the population. More than 2.3 million people have been displaced, largely internally displaced. For Yemenis, there are not a lot of places that they can travel to easily as refugees, so it's primarily internal displacement. 18 million of those are considered food insecure, and what is, I think, really significant is 8 million are considered severely food insecure. And in one of the latest releases from OCHA, there's some sense that this is projected to increase to 11.3 million. So that's a lot of people who are severely food insecure. Yemen, of course, is a highly volatile context. Things change very rapidly. The front line of fighting may change. Who has control over certain locations and areas, and how that affects transport changes dramatically. It's a very insecure context. It's insecure now, but it has been for a very long time. The types of insecurities and the specific threats have changed a bit over the last few years, but not dramatically. It's very complex as well to understand how things function and move. There are many different actors and players in multiple areas. And it has persistent operational and contextual threats. So that's one of the things I'll talk about, because CaLP asked us to look into how many of the threats were materialized versus perception. So I'll mention that briefly. As with Mali, cash transfer programming has been part of programming in Yemen for many years. And what's interesting, perhaps, and maybe different to other contexts, is that there was very, very large social protection programs run by the Yemeni government with support of a number of international actors. And this was called the Social Welfare Fund, and it reached about 1.5 million households, about 8 million people. It was stopped in March 2015 when the conflict escalated, but it was a very large program, and Yemenis have a long history of being very familiar with cash transfer programming in some form or other. And there is a very well-developed financial service provider network in Yemen. There's a great reliance and use of the Hawala system, and you can read more about that online should you be interested. But it is a familiar way for Yemenis to receive for very vulnerable Yemeni families, particularly to receive assistance either from the state or humanitarian agencies, but also for many Yemenis to receive remittances from families abroad. So that's kind of a key piece of background information to understand about the context. Cash transfer program was used by humanitarian actors as well prior to the escalation in 2015, but nothing like the scale that it is at now. And I guess one of the interesting factors raised by some of the people we spoke to was that their organization was a very minimal or low use let's say limited practitioner in the use of cash transfer programming in Yemen prior to March 2015, and their agencies have seen significant shift in sort of attitude, approach, acceptance of CTP. One thing that it's really key to say as background is it was very difficult for us to get very accurate figures on the current volume of cash transfer programming in Yemen. So there are some figures which primarily come from 2016, so that's a little while ago now, which indicate, and that's on the slide at the moment, that Yemen at that stage shared 5th place with Sierra Leone in total volume. But that actually what is perhaps more interesting is that it's in terms of proportion of programming in Yemen, it was the highest in the world. So in terms of how much agencies are using cash transfer programming. I understand OCHA is currently working on much more detailed information, so hopefully we will at least have more accurate 2017 figures very soon. And the volume has grown considerably by some reporting, but also anecdotal reporting, but we don't have the specific statistics. I think I mentioned that already, that many agencies grew their programs from a low or non-existent base. Donors broadly have been very encouraging of cash transfer programming in Yemen. Many have seen it as the primary way to grow programs rapidly for wide reach in Yemen, so that's been quite interesting. And overall, it's clear that there's a perception that cash transfer programming can continue in Yemen in multiple areas, even in the most remote and difficult, insecure areas, when possibly most other or all other modalities are impossible or at least highly challenged. And as one of our informants said, which I thought was a good sort of summary line, was that for many agencies, CTP is now seen as the go-to modality. So this is a little table we put together to try to understand how many sectors it is used across. And there isn't very detailed, but this was sort of us reaching out to a number of the stakeholders and looking through reporting. And you can see that it's used across almost every sector. Unconditional cash transfers are used across all except health, as far as we heard. But again, this is not, do not take this as covering absolutely everything, but this is what we heard through the research. Cash for work is also used very widely, and vouchers are also used. So it's multiple modalities across all sectors, depending on the organization. Just a quick summary of what how we did this. It was very similar to Mali, but we did not visit Yemen due to the time frame and the just difficulties in logistics. However, the team is familiar with Yemen. So we primarily looked at sort of Yemen-specific and sector-wide documentation on CTP risk and mitigation. We conducted a number of interviews, as well as people responded by some email questionnaires. One of our key things was to try to cover the whole period. So we did try to speak to people who had been involved in Yemen in 2015, including people who've long left. So that was really interesting to gather their perspectives and see how things have shifted. And we were lucky enough to have quite a few of our organizations who participated provide useful documentation to us. So we were able to review quite a few risk mitigation strategies and plans and internal tools and documentation for a number of agencies. So that gave us sort of rich additional material. So what did we find? I mean, overall, I guess a summary conclusion is that it's very clear that CTP is highly appropriate for, suited to the Yemeni context. And similar to Mali, interestingly, in some ways is perceived as less risky and other related in-kind modalities. And that's primarily because of the very difficult what very difficult operating conditions there are, and how that there's a high rate of theft or insecurity in transport. Despite this risk, these high level of risk and the context, actors in Yemen were largely able to mitigate the risks and substantially scale up. How did they do this? In a number of ways, but I guess overall conclusions were they used a combination of effective and ongoing analysis and monitoring, and solid collaboration on particularly some key areas, which we'll mention. A lot of adaptation, so changing, shifting dates, timing, volumes, modalities, etc. And what a lot of people described as a high level of risk transference and sharing with the private sector primarily. So perhaps unlike Mali, not as much work with local partners, although there definitely was some. But in Yemen, there's a high reliance on the use of private financial service providers. But I'll talk about the concept of risk transference in a little bit. Some other key factors or enablers to this included, and I've kind of mentioned them, so I guess the historic presence of and familiarity with large-scale cash transfer programs in Yemen, the infrastructure and experience to support this was a key factor. So agencies were not building something from scratch. There was a familiar and existing infrastructure for cash programming. A lot of donors, institutional donors, had what was considered fairly supportive and flexible approaches for their humanitarian partners. And an interesting factor, which didn't come up widely, but from a number of agencies, was the feeling that their own organizations were willing to take risks, adjust, sort of take bold steps to grow these programs and move into the unknown, I guess. Wasn't the case with all agencies, but certainly this came up from a number of agencies as an enabler. So we had a lot of categories of risk. There were three broad ones. So there was a whole bunch of economic factors, both macroeconomic but also micro to some extent where it came to traders. There's a very detailed table which I decided not to put on the slide because it's a bit too much data to look at in one slide, but please look at it in the report. And that has sort of the three main categories, and there's sort of subcategories, and then there's a very long detailed list of all the risk factors that were mentioned. One key thing to mention, and I probably should have said it up front, is that risk was approached, the definition of risk was approached fairly flexibly because all of the respondents answered quite differently or flexibly. So we have called them risk factors primarily, or in some cases threats. This is because we couldn't, in a scientific way, say that every single one of these went through a formal risk assessment process, which is to look at things like vulnerability, probability, impact, etc. So that would be the normal approach. In this case, we've primarily called them risk factors or threats. Second category was the operating context itself, which is very, very significant. This is both the baseline of what Yemen is like to work in as a context, but also the specific factors related to the conflict. And the third area were what we called programming risk factors. So they were really more related to actually how you implement quality programs and things like accountability and due diligence. A key one to note, which is again very similar to Mali, is it was clear to us that very few risk factors affected CTP only. I can mention a couple, but for the most part, almost every single one of the risks that came up or risk factors that were mentioned were considered to impact almost all types or multiple types of programming in Yemen. As I mentioned earlier, we were asked to look at perception versus sort of actuality. In most cases, most of the key risks had materialized to some extent. So the issue of perception of risk is not such a big issue in Yemen, apart from a couple of areas which I'll mention. Most of the issues had been experienced by agencies. Geographically, there wasn't substantial north-south variation. So Yemen's conflict is primarily called a north-south conflict, so it's much, much more complicated than that. The variation wasn't huge according to our research. So the issue was primarily pockets of higher risk or remote area additional risk. But most of the risk factors existed throughout the country, but varied depending on small pockets or remoteness. So there are a lot of risk factors mentioned in the report. I won't go through all of them because it's too much detail, but please feel free to look at the table in your time. These are the ones that kind of came up as mentioned more often or considered more significant for a lot of organizations. So a big one was the weaknesses, existing and potential weaknesses or failures in the national banking system and the currency. This is a really significant issue for Yemen. The currency is not a stable currency, and we'll talk a little bit about exchange rate issues later on, but this is something that is mentioned pretty much universally by every single person in any report that we read. Concerns that the banking system would collapse at some point, or that the currency fluctuations would have such, and they did have a very significant impact and still do on most humanitarian operations. The collapse of the banking system was one of the perceived risks that hasn't eventuated per se. However, the issue of de-risking, again, please feel free to read more if you're interested, but this is a big issue for Yemen, which is most banks are connected internationally to a whole network of banking, and it's a choice that some financial institutions take to either not work with a country because of the risks they perceive of working with that country, either because of fraud, corruption, money laundering, or it could be related to terrorist funding going to terrorist organizations, etc. This has been an issue for Yemen, and interestingly, a number of agencies, including UN donors, NGOs, etc., all had experienced this to some extent. Just moving money in and out of Yemen was a big challenge. Because of, very closely linked to this, volatile markets are a big issue. So price fluctuations, availability of goods in the market, etc. It's a very significant issue for Yemen. Service providers, interestingly, while the system is very reliant on financial service providers, there were perceptions, again, which had materialized to some extent, that service providers had very varying quality in their ability to manage processes effectively and follow due diligence and compliance. There are a lot of security issues specifically related to the conflict, which most of them are fairly evident, but around movement. But some of them are not so evident, perhaps, and this relates a little bit to the 2 down, which is around political context. So some of it's around the perception of organizations, attacks on those organizations and their reputation, all that sort of thing, how they work, where they work. So this is definitely an ongoing issue for Yemen. There are a number of general operational issues, how effective it is to use technology in a country that has poor communications infrastructure, major issues with power, etc. So that's a challenge. Access was continuously mentioned by every agency in any conversation that we had and any report, just physically moving around the country. The political context I've mentioned, complex, number of different parties, groups, factions, tribes, leaders to negotiate with in multiple areas, so it makes it very complicated. Similar again to Mali, so I was very interested to hear what Hélène said. Aid diversion, obviously a very high issue of concern for most donors, didn't come up as much as we had thought as a major concern or risk. I mean, it was mentioned that agencies felt this was a concern and had to be planned for, but overall it was felt that this was not nearly as significant as perhaps people had perceived or the reputation of Yemen might indicate. As always, protection issues are a challenge. Monitoring, also difficult, just physically getting access, and third-party monitoring is quite widely used in Yemen. A number of issues related to program integrity, which things like targeting lists, selection of beneficiaries, etc., and then targeting itself as a whole category as well. Very complex, especially because the need is so enormous. It is not possible to cover all the needs, and so very tight processes of targeting and selection have to be undertaken, which can cause friction in communities. And it's difficult. It's a constant struggle for most agencies. So there's a lot of mitigation measures used, and these are outlined in the report, so I won't go through all of them, but some of the ones that were mentioned as most effective or most commonly used was, as I've mentioned, the use of service providers, which enabled the transferring or sharing of risk. A key thing to say here, and we highlight this in the report, is while a lot of people use the term risk transference, it's very, very clear that actually most of the risks related to compliance and other things cannot be transferred. Donors are very clear on this. They still hold the organization accountable who holds the contract to ensure compliance. So this is something that came up, and we wanted to highlight it because it was very interesting to hear how often people use the term, well, risk has been transferred or shared. But in fact, a lot of agencies still hold that the compliance requirements themselves. And in fact, in this increasing environment of expectations by donors around compliance and due diligence, that is not going to lessen but only increase. Assessments of banks or financial service providers was a key thing, and in fact a lot of agencies, or a number of agencies, spoke about the fact that they had re-tendered more often to try to get either better arrangements, better rates, or to include new conditions related to things like protection of data. And it related also to the sharing of information such as whitelists and blacklists of banks and service providers, which we saw in Yemen more than has been seen in other contexts. A lot of agencies had different strategies around trying to manage the potential risk of or threat of bank collapse and issues of liquidity, just not enough cash available physically, such as making smaller and more frequent transfers to banks. And at times, agencies had to withdraw their money back when a bank indicated, this is more a couple of years ago, when banks indicated they just didn't have enough cash to complete the financial distribution, the cash distribution. So one of the agencies we spoke to had to actually pull back the entire transfer that they had made. Really important one, and I think there are people who are listening in who can speak about this in more detail than me, but collective negotiation exchange rates became a very, very critical mitigation measure in Yemen and still is. Exchange rates has been for quite some time a very difficult and challenging operational issue in Yemen, and there was some what was viewed widely as very effective work done on collective exchange rate negotiation through the Cash and Markets Working Group and the advisors, the cash advisors that supported that. So that was the key one. Program monitoring, especially post-distribution monitoring, and that's fairly obvious, not unusual, but also third-party monitoring and then more follow-up on the monitoring. The existence and effectiveness of the Cash and Markets Working Group itself, which is considered one of the more effective ones globally, so that's great, and advisors such as things like the Common Minimum Expenditure Basket, rates and targeting criteria. The use of community structures for targeting mobilization and conflict. A number of agencies said this was really, really fundamental for them in preparing communities and working with them so that there was not going to be conflict around targeting. All right, I'm trying to come to my summary. There are a lot of very, very rich lessons, and they, again, are more detailed in the report, but here are some highlights. It's clear that an effective and resourced Cash and Markets Working Group has been very important for Yemen, with a sort of committed and multi-sectoral membership, so not seeing it sitting just in the foods or agriculture area, but seeing it including kind of all sectors. And there are a lot of joint initiatives on as we've mentioned, on exchange rate negotiation, et cetera, on the minimum expenditure basket. Remote monitoring of the market has been used in Yemen, and this seems like something that would be hard to be accurate, but the perception was that this has been a very useful tool, and this is including monitoring the markets from outside the country, but using price information coming from inside. The volatile currency issue, I mean, it's very significant for Yemen, but again, the lesson was if you manage it well and you have analysis and you are adaptable, it is possible to implement even in spite of volatile currency. Again, feeling was managing donor concerns, that frequent communication with donors was seen as key. A number of the donors themselves mentioned the level of communication they have with partners, and sharing of information was critical for the partners themselves. As I've mentioned, risk transfer is a misleading term, as only some risks can be transferred, and these are primarily operational security risks, but not things like compliance and aid diversion, fraud, corruption. There were clearly the experience of Yemen, the embedded experience of a long history of forms of cash programming in Yemen was very significant in the scale-up and enabled it to happen. One of the perceptions was that, again, aid diversion has not been nearly as significant as some people have perceived. And the feeling of a number of agencies was that the need is so high, and in some cases the transfer amount's not that enormous, that the issue of diversion is perceived, certainly, as not a significant issue. So there is little to no evidence that money has gone particularly to fund terrorist activities. There is some concerns about whether money is used on CAT, which is the product that's chewed very commonly, particularly by men in Yemen. But apart from that, it's not considered to be a major issue. The issue of beneficiary targeting is very political, but can be managed. Technology has been useful for Yemen. It's used in a different way, perhaps in other contexts, because of the use of financial service providers, but it's important. You need to be nimble and adaptable, as I've mentioned. And I guess the last one, which came quite clearly, was that a number of economic risk factors around banking, exchange rates, markets, needs more than just internal lobbying. It really needs national and international intervention outside of Yemen. And this has been key in Yemen, where things like keeping ports open and working with suppliers to ensure they're still willing to come and helping with the guaranteeing of shipping to Yemen, etc., has been very key for Yemen. There are a lot of recommendations, but I've summarized them here. There's a whole lot, which again, interestingly, also mirrors well with Mali, was while a lot of agencies had many methods for doing risk analysis, and a lot of the analysis was quite common, I guess our concern was that it's quite inefficient that agencies are all doing the same kind of risk analysis, and that donors have multiple formats required by organizations. So one of our recommendations is that this should be much more collective and systematic, including agencies reviewing incidents against their plans. So how often they have experienced the threats which are in their plans and at what levels, and not just them, others. And we recommend that there be a lot more open sharing of risk analysis, because it takes a lot of time and a lot of work in a very difficult context. And while some risks are very agent-specific, I would say more than 90% are very common to all. So that was one of our recommendations. We think collective exchange rate negotiation has clearly been very effective for Yemen and in other similar contexts where the currency is so volatile, that this is very, very useful and should be used. Joint advocacy on risks by humanitarian agencies has been useful, and there are a number of agencies that have worked together on these, but perhaps not as widely as it could be, so this could be used more. And as we said in the learning, governments must continue to intervene on key economic risk factors. Cash and markets working groups can be very, very, very useful and are critical, and our perception is that they should probably have a wider mandate than they are seen as having in many contexts, including in Yemen, where it's seen as primarily a technical coordination group. The feeling is that it should perhaps be wider than this and have more influence and provide more guidance at a policy level or practice level. Lack of data or access to data on Yemen really needs to be rectified. Yemen is a country that a lot of people have great interest in terms of what's happening and how CTP scale-up has been managed. But if we can't demonstrate that with very accurate data on the sheer volume and spread across sectors and the use of different modalities, it's quite difficult to speak to it. So we're hoping that this is fixed very quickly and resourced if necessary to make it happen. And the last area was a number of issues that came up for us that we felt there probably wasn't quite enough information on. So the issue of gender surprisingly didn't come up nearly as much as we thought in Yemen. It did a bit in terms of the slightly different risks for women and men, but we felt this probably needed more analysis. Minority groups, this didn't come up much, and we know this is an issue in Yemen. The issue of people living with disabilities or other marginalized groups didn't come up much, and we couldn't find much written on it. And the issue of data protection, of course, is increasingly important, along with safeguarding. And while we were able to do some analysis of this, and you can see this in the report, we felt that maybe this warranted some specific analysis in Yemen, and perhaps this is something that the Cash and Markets Working Group could look at to share how things like data protection have been managed, particularly with the high use of financial service providers. I think that's enough from me. I've talked long enough, so I will stop now and hand back to you, Phil.
Thank you very much, Jo. Thank you very much, both of you, Hélène and Jo, for presentations. There's a lot of exciting learning coming out of both of them. As mentioned at the beginning, we, CaLP, commissioned these case studies with the goal to create and share learning about the implementation of cash in challenging contexts, to look at the potential mitigation measures and ideally learning for program design and response decisions in other challenging environments. Therefore, we chose 2 countries where we knew that cash is being scaled. The Mali case study had a bit of a clearer focus on comparing the different modality-specific risks, comparing risk related to in-kind with risk related to cash. But it also identified obviously context-specific risks. And the Yemen case study had a bit of a more broader look at all the risks related to the implementation of cash programming in Yemen, be they cash-specific or just context-specific. What we heard from both case studies is that most of the risks mentioned for CTP implementation are not CTP specific, they're not modality specific, but rather relevant for all modalities related to the contexts. And interestingly, also some traditionally CTP specific risks, which were anticipated or expected to be happening, such as data diversion, were not mentioned as a significant issue in both cases. There are a couple of parallels between the 2 case studies. Jo has already highlighted some of them. I want to additionally mention a few before we go to the questions, a few of the common topics and recommendations which were mentioned in both cases. Firstly, obviously, both case studies say clearly that risk analysis should be strong and systematic and should be done not only for cash but for all transfer modalities. A second topic, which one of our old friends is coordination, which came up once again. Both case studies emphasize that risk management and risk analysis should be coordinated and shared among all CTP implementers. That could be done, for example, the Cash Working Group or the Cash and Markets Group in the case of Yemen. But also that it's important to share the risk analysis within the organization, specifically the departments related or working with risk. Both case studies also mention new technologies, and that new technologies can be beneficial for cash, including for risk management. And thus, it's important to have access to new technologies. Both case studies mentioned that the program needs to stay flexible and adaptable to be able to quickly adjust the program to a changing situation. And in different forms, I guess I heard the keyword preparedness. It's mentioned that it's important to prepare ahead, and both experiences from Yemen and Mali show that the previous experience with cash was very beneficial for scale-up and the massive scale-up of cash. Both case studies also mentioned that it's important to local structures, local communities, and I think it was in Mali which mentioned, or at least it's in the case study, it's important to develop a network of reliable actors, local actors. That is, but it was also mentioned that we should be careful with transferring risk to local actors. Finally, and this goes with the point I just mentioned, important to adapt to the context, both cash or voucher program, but also the mitigation measures. With this, I'm opening for questions and comments. As mentioned earlier, unfortunately, the chat box is not working. Ideally, the microphones are. please use the little hand or click on the little man or woman raising her or his hand at the top of the screen to raise your hand. And please switch on your microphone once you are allowed to speak. Please share any questions or thoughts. It would be specifically great to hear some reflections from Yemen or Mali, but I'm also very interested to hear from all the others about if we missed something, if there's any gaps, and if you think that these recommendations and findings can be adapted to other contexts as well. And I see that Kazi has raised her hand. Go ahead. We cannot hear you at this moment. Kazi? You have to switch on your microphone, which is at the top of the screen as well, the little microphone icon. That helps. Meantime, we can go to Elodie. Go ahead, Elodie.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for the two presentations. I have a question about...
Maybe a bit louder, please.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but it's a bit far away.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for Hélène and also Jo. I was just wondering if they've noticed a difference of perception of risk depending on the sectors. And because what I'm hearing in this presentation is, okay, CTP is perceived as less risky than in-kind distribution, but for the health sector or education sector, for example, in-kind distribution is not really big. It's more like direct service provision. So I was just wondering if you've noticed some differences in the perception of risk.
You want Stefan to answer each question individually, or do you want to take a bunch of questions and we answer them afterwards?
I think it's easier to just go ahead for now, because there's no other hands raised. But if you could answer these questions.
Sure. So for mine, in terms of Mali, and I think the question is excellent and is worth having a look. The bulk of CTP in Mali is used for to cover food security needs. So we don't have this granularity, and it's not mentioned in the report. So we have it analyzed as a bulk across sectors, so to speak, but it actually very much reflects the view of the food security sector.
And I would say it's pretty much the same in terms of Yemen, although that is, again, a really interesting question that I would have liked to delve in a little more. Again, similarly, while our diagram showed, of course, that it's used across many sectors, the bulk, what we understood is that it's primarily related to food or household needs, and that it does include things like fuel and transport, etc. So we don't have that level of granularity either in Yemen, and
Thank you, both of you. Any other questions or reflections from Yemen or Mali? So there's a couple of hands now. So I guess we take these two questions before Hélène and Jo can answer them. Mali, please go ahead. Cannot hear you at this point, fortunately. Try to switch on your microphone. Walid. So we go ahead while Walid is working on his microphone. Laura, could you please go ahead and see you?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks very much for that presentation. It was really interesting. I just had a quick clarification question on methodology of the research. You mentioned in both case studies it was done primarily with interviews. I'm wondering, were only or were community members interviewed as well, and recipients of the cash assistance and non-recipients of cash assistance, were they also interviewed to have their views triangulated against maybe the perceptions of NGOs?
So in Mali, you want to go ahead, Jo?
No, you go.
Okay. So in Mali, no, unfortunately, due to lack of access to northern Mali. So we haven't triangulated practitioner perception with those of beneficiary. We thought about, so this is one of the limitations of the methodology. At the same time, though, the scope was on how practitioner perceived risks and the extent to which this has an effect on their response analysis, because this is one of the identified barriers. So happy to hear your thought as to the extent to which it could have added value, but the focus in this instance was very much put into humanitarian perception.
Yes, very similar, although Hélène and I did not speak about this, but we took exactly the same approach, that our analysis was primarily about the agency's analysis of the risk for them implementing and how they mitigated those risks in order to deliver. So again, it would have been interesting to hear the perception of communities, but it would have been slightly on a tangent to the primary focus of the research. Again, direct access to beneficiaries wasn't possible. We did not go to Yemen in this case. But even if we had, I think the probability of us being able to go to the field in such a short time frame is very limited, and I'm not sure it would have added significant.
Yes, just to add to that. Sorry.
That's it.
Sorry, Jo, are you still talking?
No, I think we have a time delay, but I'm done.
Okay, sorry for that. Just to add to that, yes, the scope of the work of both of the studies was not to look at, let's say, the beneficiary perspective or the beneficiary perspective. Really, as Hélène and Jo have explained, look at the perception of risk within the organization to understand how risks are perceived and how decisions are made within organizations considering these risks. I'm handing over to Federico, and after him, Walid. I hope in the meantime the microphone is working. Federico. I cannot hear you, unfortunately, at this point. Please try to switch on your microphone at the top screen. Walid, I see that you are speaking. Your microphone is giving signs that you're speaking, but I cannot hear you. Not sure what is happening there. Unfortunate. Any other questions in the meantime? Let's try to switch on the mic. No other questions, reflections. It would be great to hear representatives from Yemen, be it the cash working group, former cash camp advisors working in Yemen. Yes, Von Vossen. Go ahead, I help you. I cannot hear you either. Now I can hear something. I think you have to speak a bit louder, Von Vossen.
It didn't mention that what the complaint mechanism was in place cash program in Yemen.
It was very far away and a bit unclear. Could you try again?
I want to ask about the Yemen case study, about the, it didn't mention that what kind of complaint mechanism put in place in such a cash program.
It's a really good question. There was a number of things mentioned, but I'm wondering if it would be more interesting to hear from any of the people within Yemen, such as Wandwasan, or I can see there were a couple of others who were on as well who could talk about specifically how their agencies handle it, rather than me giving a generic response. Moses or Wandwasan or the technology is against us in this case.
Fortunately, many mics.
Okay, I'll try to summarize. If either of them are able to come in or want to Skype me, I can add information from them. So there's quite a lot of robust mechanisms in Yemen, and a number of agencies spoke about how they try to handle this in terms of giving information at the point of distribution around telephone numbers, names, details, having focal points at communities who can also receive complaints. My understanding is it works, the perception anyway is that it works fairly well, that in fact Yemenis are fairly comfortable and confident in raising concerns and complaints, and these mechanisms are well utilized, although the actual number of issues that were serious enough to warrant investigation were low, so it was primarily related to people's concerns about being included or not included, the amounts, that sort of thing. But my understanding is it is considered that they are well known and well utilized complaints mechanisms. I wish I could give you more detail on exactly what agencies are using, but this is the generic kind of feedback that we were given. If either Moses or Wandwasan wants to Skype me, I can add more information, or Tom or anybody else. Okay.
Ian, raise your hand. Go ahead, I hear you.
Yeah,
Yes, I can hear something. Go away.
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you.
Yeah, you can hear me. Great. I'm just going back to the complaints mechanism. There's a few in place. We have hotlines where the beneficiaries can come and complain or raise their concerns, but mostly it's about the assistance they will get, whether it's cash, they're on the list or not on the list. Also, we have face-to-face where they can come in and speak to male and female social counsellors, and they can raise their concerns this way, as well as having complaints boxes.
Just to add on that, are these complaint mechanisms working well? Are they well used?
Yeah, the hotlines. Yes, the hotlines, they're not afraid to speak, and you see when they come in and they come and speak, they're not afraid to speak, especially when it comes to seeking assistance.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I hope that helps.
That helps. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. All right, great.
Handing over to Harith, or Harith. Harith, we cannot hear you at this point. Please switch on your microphone. No, we cannot hear you. Unfortunately, I'm very sorry for these tech difficulties. Chat is not working today for some reason. The microphones are not working. I still would take another 2 or 3 questions today. Any takers? Questions or comments or recommendations? Anything welcome. If not, I want to thank again Jo and Hélène for this nice webinar and these very concise summaries and presentations. If you have any questions related to case studies, please feel free to reach out to me. Both of the case studies are online. Please also take a look at our thematic page on CTP and risk, where we will be uploading our as well, and webinars as well. And with this, thanks a lot for joining us, and have a good day. Bye.
Thank you all, and thank you for joining to listen to the case study.